I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, but discussing Russia, China, and the New World Order. Al Mayadeen television, Kalima Horra, free word. We have an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. The proximate cause of this discussion was the G7 meeting in Biarritz, when, sharp-eyed as always, I spotted some interesting omissions and additions. For example, the bankrupt economy of Italy was represented by the then pro-tem Prime Minister, but India was not represented. China was not represented. Russia was not represented. Indeed, Russia had been specifically excluded from this. So I got to thinking, what kind of world forum is it where some of the world's biggest economies are not present, some of the world's biggest political players are not present, where the maestro, the greatest foreign minister on the planet, Mr. Lavrov, would not be allowed to enter, whilst other countries with lesser claims to be there were present? It would mean necessarily that some of the world's biggest economic issues could not properly be addressed, and certainly that some of the world's biggest political issues could not be addressed. I choose one almost at random. The Kashmir question between India and Pakistan, both sides nuclear armed, then warming up to what looked like a potential all-out war between them. Well, that couldn't be on the agenda because neither country was there. And thinking more about it, it seemed to me that the G7 meeting in Biarritz was like looking into a museum of the past big players, excluding the new big players as a matter of deliberate policy. A relic, in other words, a relic of a unipolar world which existed, historically speaking, only briefly and no longer exists at all. China is the most populous country in the world. China is either the biggest or the second biggest economy in the world, the biggest army in the world, an absolute giant. What madness is this not to want to hear from them? Russia is the biggest country in Europe. Moscow is the biggest city in Europe. Russia is at the heart of many of the great issues currently being played out in the world. What madness is that to keep them out of the G7? This relic, of course, is important. The countries in it are important. All countries are important. But they are all ways of, if you like, bypassing the world forum that is supposed to exist, in which all countries have membership, which is the proper place for these big international issues to be addressed. But they can't be because the United Nations is in stasis. It is literally a bystander to all of the great international issues. Nothing can be agreed there. The prestige and importance of the General Assembly is practically zero, and the Security Council absolutely deadlocked, with the United States, Russia, and China essentially vetoing any initiative by the other, representing a logjam in international relations. So, what is to be done, as a very famous Russian once asked? And I'm asking you, a very famous British businessman and economist, to kick off this debate, please.
Thank you very much indeed, George. So my name is Trevor Williams. I'm a professor of banking and finance at University of Derby and also a former chief economist of Lloyds Bank. So I agree with much of what you've said, George, absolutely. The world is changing and changing fast. The G7 is representative of countries that are rich in per head terms, but even on that basis, you're absolutely right, Italy wouldn't be in it. I mean, it's 15th. It's even outside the top 10 countries in the world in terms of nominal GDP, and in per head terms, it's outside of that too. So I think the world is changing fast, and the G7, as you say, is a relic of the past when they actually did command enough of a share of the world economy to dominate it, and they no longer do that for some of the reasons that you've stated. So I think there's a bit of nuance required. If you look at the E7 on their own and you adjust GDP for differences in purchasing power and inflation between countries, the E7 economies in terms of PPP are actually bigger than the G7 countries if you made a direct comparison. Yeah, in fact, they're 13 trillion bigger. Wow. Whereas in GDP terms, if you measure it using current exchange rates, the G7 has got a GDP of 15 a trillion bigger than the E7. So but we should measure it in terms of PPP. So that is part of the way that the world has changed, and the economic geography of the world is shifting towards larger populations that are catching up with many of the countries that have high living standards. And so it is changing fast, and the institutions of the world that manage the politics and the power relationships ought to change to reflect it. But you've pointed out part of the problem. The relic of the past is the United Nations Security Council, on which you have countries that can veto any decisions that are made. And so nothing gets done. A couple of final points that I may make before passing the baton on to others. What's to be done about it? Well, I think we should strengthen some of the forums that already exist. So there is a G20. And in the G20 would come all the countries that you've mentioned: India, China, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia. These are big players. Pakistan, they'd all drop into the G20. And that's a forum that should be beefed up, and more decision-making should be given to that. But I'm afraid that the Security Council needs to be reformed as well as a second part of this. And one of the things that one has to say is, how can the UK any longer hold on to its United Nations Council seat when it frankly does not have either the military or the economic clout as a share of global GDP to be able to stay on it? And I suspect that over time that will change.
But the people on it already would have to agree to it being changed.
Well, this is the problem. There needs to be a majority unanimity. They can veto being voted off it, which is a strange thing. So once you're a member of the club, you can never be kicked out of the club, which is not healthy.
Hotel California.
There you go. Yeah, you can check out, but you can never leave. Yes. Another thing worth saying, George, about why this is an inevitable shift, an inexorable shift, and can't be reversed, is the population difference, which you alluded to. But actually, if you think about the E7 countries as a bloc, their population is over 3.5 billion.
So that's half the world.
Which is roughly half the world. Whereas the G7, together, they only come to about 700. Now, I say only in parentheses. Every human life matters, and I don't want to diminish that at all. Every single one matters. But that's 777 million people, as opposed to
3.5 billion.
3.5 billion in the E7. So that's a balance of the shift that's taking place, and the income differences will accrue over time. But you have to understand a final point, George. The E7 are poor in terms of per capita incomes. And this means that living standards for people in these countries are only 1/6 or 1/7 of that of the rich countries. India, for example, in per capita terms, is the 122nd poorest country in the world. So it does make a difference. They need to work hard to catch up in terms of the amount that they spend in welfare benefits for their people, hospital care, education, roads, and all of the things that increase our living standards. They have a long way to go. And so that's the third bit of the progress which needs to be which needs to be placed on those that want to catch up with the rich world's living standards.
That's really helpful, Professor. Thank you for that. Let me press you, though, on just one more point, if I may. it's not that this is an accidental seven. I mean, it excluded China when it was formed because China was not then the powerhouse that it has become today. But it recently, comparatively, excluded Russia for political reasons, for the so-called annexation of Crimea. Now, whether you agree with that terminology or not, it of course represents a double standard. Mr. Netanyahu, for example, just campaigned in an election in which he pledged to annex the Jordan Valley and has already annexed East Jerusalem and already annexed the Golan Heights, which belongs to Syria. Not only would anyone not dream of excluding Israel from international fora as a result, in fact, they're endlessly rewarded. They're the biggest recipients of US aid. So the same US is the point I'm making, that excluded Russia because of Crimea, bankrolls another country which is endlessly annexing other people's territory. So it's politically driven, is my point.
Yes, look, I don't want to comment so much on why Russia was excluded or not, but just to make the point that maybe it shouldn't have been included in the first place.
Really?
If you're excluded, and the point is, if you're excluding the others to world relationships, to the key drivers of world wealth and prosperity and decision-making, which matters, then you should have included the other countries that we mentioned as well. You know, if you got Russia there, well, China's bigger.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, quite right.
You know,
making it a G8.
So
as it was,
we don't. I don't think we
problem.
want to be in a G7. I don't think we should. I think the G7 is defunct. I think it's a relic of the past, and I think we should focus on the G20, if anything, and not the G7. It's a
Biarritz is a lovely
club.
place, so they probably had a very nice weekend. Thank you, Professor. Ella Rule, you are one of Britain's leading communists. You're a friend of China. I'm guessing you think the sore thumb sticking out here most is China.
Well, actually, I think I take the whole thing from a quite different point of view.
Please.
Looking at the history of the G7, which started as the G6, when was it formed? It was formed in 1973, just after the Yom Kippur War,
when the big oil price
when the
rise
oil
and shock.
when there was an oil embargo by the Arab countries in order to, if you like, try and put pressure on imperialism, to get Israel to step down. And it was always a club of imperialist interests whose function was to think, well, how do we fight back against these oppressed countries who are getting together to frustrate our wishes? And I have to ask, well, why would I want to be a member of that particular club? I think that, one of the things which sees the weakening of the G7 as much as anything else is that the imperialist interests are being undermined all over the world by the fact that China's coming along, offering better terms to all the countries that used to be financially, and still are financially oppressed to some extent by these imperialist countries, but actually have gotten a bit of a way out. And this is reducing the profitability of the multinational corporations, and therefore is weakening imperialism and making it extremely difficult, especially now that we've had an economic crisis, which was a problem anyway, causing austerity, poverty, and resistance in the populations of the imperialist countries, and made worse by the fact that we can't just go, our imperialist masters can't just go and turn the screw a bit tighter as they would like, because, if you like, there's competition from China, which actually stops them from bleeding people dry in quite the way they used to. As with regard to Russia, I agree with you. Russia should never have been there in the first place. It was a little sop to Gorbachev in the time. But Russia and China are there for the imperialist countries to think of, how we can keep them down, how we can keep them under control. They're not there to come and join the club. They're not interested in a club
but
which
such a
is
gathering. I mean, Italy can't even form a government. It's budget is dictated by Brussels. It's not in a position to bully or dominate anyone.
Yeah, but you can't get rid of it. It was there in 1973. And of course, in 1973, Russia was still a very big power. It was still left out, showing that this is an imperialist
A political
club.
construct rather than an economic one. Yeah. Thank you for that. Gentleman there.
Thank you, George. Shabir Razvi, Director, International Finance Solutions Associate in London, an economic political commentator. I entirely agree with our previous two commentators, and the PPP concept that you presented is really the true measure, because in reality, as we know, a pound can only buy a tin of Coke, while a pound in India, Pakistan, China can still buy a breakfast, if you like. So, just to say that I've got more dollars and pounds in the pocket doesn't really make sense. Leaving that as a sort of concept for people...
I'm boycotting Coke, just for the record. Go ahead.
For your viewers to really understand what PPP means, to break it down in basic terms, I think the G7, not only is it a relic and defunct, but as I think our dear friend suggested, that perhaps it needs a new setup of grouping of countries. Mr. Boris Johnson recently in Parliament said that Mr. Corbyn is interested in people in Moscow, Caracas, and Tehran, and perhaps Moscow, Tehran, and Caracas are more important, because he realizes that these are the cities where deals are happening, power is happening. And just to quote a very famous poet from the subcontinent, Allama Iqbal Lahori, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He lived over 100 years ago, who did his Barat Law in London, did his PhD from Germany, and he really quite poignantly, 100 years ago, had a vision. He said, if Tehran becomes the Geneva of the East, the destiny of mankind would change. So I think in the metrics, it's not only Beijing and Moscow which are important, but I think Tehran is becoming crucially important, as we know with what's been happening in the Middle East. Yes, it's got sanctions, and one feels that, a whole host of issues are taking place. And I think really, as an understanding of that, Mr. Macron invited Zarif for a meeting at the resort, knowing that the voice from Tehran carries a lot of weight. In South Africa, in South American countries, in Africa, it may not have the economic clout, but certainly has the political clout, which matters a lot in geopolitical sense. So that's one point that I like to make as far as what's happening with G7 and what the future holds. I think the other angle that perhaps we could look at why G7 is defunct and is a relic is I think, Paris, London, Washington are living in their own bubble. And I think Macron, again, quite pointedly said that the hegemony of the West is finished at that particular conference, if you recall.
Yes, he said it after the conference,
yes.
a press conference, but it was a powerful statement that we are living at the end of Western hegemony.
Absolutely. So I think, sober minds and wise minds, even of the former imperial powers, are realizing that we need to do something if the West is going to survive in its current format, because it's potentially possible that when immigration was taking place back from the developing countries to the West, it's possible that people may be immigrating from here to the developing world, because the economic power will change in such a dramatic way in the next 10, 15, 20 years that people have to think about where their bread and butter is. Because as we know, with the austerity measures over the last 10 years, people's wages haven't increased. There's huge pressure on their budgets. People will start thinking whether Malaysia is a better place to live, or Indonesia, India, Pakistan, if possibly the sanctions are finished on Iran, maybe people might start thinking of Iran, because people used to go and work in their millions during the Shah from the whole of the subcontinent and the Middle East and Africa. So that thing can happen again. So I think, just to sort of purely in economic terms, if we analyze it, it gives us a perspective, but also look at the political and the geopolitical implications of what's happening globally. Without that, an understanding is really perhaps not very clear.
Let me ask you, why can't the United Nations do this job? Why do we need a G6, G7, G8, G20? If all the countries in the world are in the United Nations, why can't that be the forum in which the political and economic issues in the world are played out?
Well, the United Nations can be a forum and should be a forum, but as quite rightly pointed out, that 5 nations have a veto on that, and really the 2 former imperial powers and 1 new imperial power, and then you've got Beijing and Moscow, the 2 economies which have developed significantly post-war, and especially in the last 20, 30 years. So until that veto power is taken away, then I think the whole evaluation of global issues, whether it's climate, poverty, discrimination, sidelining of poorer nations. And the other thing that happens, as you know very well, George, is America really manipulates the weaker powers at the United Nations by either blackmailing them,
bugging them, burgling them, blackmailing them.
Absolutely.
But you can only be blackmailed if you let yourself be blackmailed. I have limited sympathy for those that say, well, if I go to New York, the Americans are going to push me around. Well, you can always stand up.
No, I don't mean just sort of bugging and so on. The Confessions of a Hitman, which is a very well-known book, the writer quite describes how loans are given and then loans are sort of deposited in the country's account, and the following day they go to Halliburton and the debt is loaded onto the poor nations. And through those debts, they're manipulated, the leaders, and in the end, if they don't abide by, and the classic example that I can give you perhaps is the Noriega, the leader of Panama, who was the sort of the drug dealer for Mr. Bush. But when he decided really that the Panama Canal should really contribute for the Panamanians, he was sort of picked up, taken to Florida, Miami, and put into prison for many years. Or Chile, if Allende stood up against the USA, the whole family were annihilated. So there are these dangers that exist in many nations, that manipulation, if not manipulation, then annihilation of the leadership exists, which perhaps in some ways subdues. That's why I think Tehran is the biggest challenge to the Western hegemony. And it has obviously made inroads in South America with Caracas, with Cuba. So dynamics are changing, mindsets are changing, but I think the hubris really precludes the Western leaders from thinking in a very positive and constructive manner.
A very good line to end the first half of the show. We'll be right back with more. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, but discussing actually the world order, and how this alphabet soup of G6s, 7s, 8s, 20s, and all the rest of it fit into. In other words, the furniture of that world order. We took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
How relevant is the G7 today, and what do you think its role is in the world?
I still think it's relevant, so I think their role is to meet and set policies that impact the rest of the world.
The one thing I know that the G7 was working on recently, when they got together, the Amazon forest fires were happening, and they tried to take a stance on that. And my impression of that was it wasn't really going far enough. And if they could come together and take a stronger position that said we're going to do and take stronger action on those sorts of issues.
The main function of G7 is to set common rules among the most powerful countries. And not always these rules are well understood.
I think, the G7 essentially need to get together and discuss global issues, ideally to make the world a better place.
What role does the G7 play in the world, in your view?
Getting nations together to discuss things.
I think the role should be to tackle the major issues of the world today. So obviously, clearly, one of the biggest challenges is probably going to be global warming.
With the rise of China and Russia, do you think the G7 is still a relevant organisation?
I think it can still be relevant. It sort of depends on the choices that those countries wish to make within the G7 and whether they can stay together enough and consistent enough as a group and represent a collective shared set of values. My impression is, what I understand about those countries is they can have a shared set of values that make sense as a group, so it seems like it can be relevant to me, yeah.
I think it's still relevant as organization that ensures that the world economic system is fair, or should be fair, and follow rules.
I think it's still hugely important that the important economies of the world are meeting and discussing important issues.
Does China and Russia need the G7, or does the G7 need them?
It's a difficult question. I mean, I would say they don't need each other, but I would say that, I think it's a good thing if they did get together and talk, to be honest. I mean, yeah, clearly China and Russia can go off and do their own thing, as can the other G7 nations, but I think if you want kind of, global consensus on anything from, how you tackle pollution, to other things really, other political questions, and I think, obviously you need to include two big powers like Russia and China.
The shared set of values point there was one that we didn't explore. Perhaps better not. I'm not sure what that shared set of values would actually be. Madam, the floor is yours.
It's Carol Gould. I'm an American broadcaster and author.
Welcome.
Lived here 43 years.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'll tell you what I thought was interesting. When I was researching what I was going to say today, found this article. May I hold it up to the camera? The Guardian, Larry Elliott, 2015, the G7 should be scrapped. That's 4 years ago. It's hopeless, divided, and outdated, which I thought was interesting. At that time, the issues were very different. The big issue was Greece. Was it going to leave the European community? There were other issues. It's hard to believe that in 4 years, so many things have changed. I'd like to go back to what President Macron said right after the G7. I think his speech, as you said, it was important.
It was very significant.
Very significant. And he mentioned the fact that in the 18th century, France, the Reformation, dominated the way the world was looking ahead. 19th century, Britain, the Industrial Revolution, we could say that was good and bad, because it started the ball rolling on what we're dealing with now, which is pollution, the global, this dreadful situation with climate change. 20th century, and I can speak as an American, I think it's important to have the American viewpoint here. 20th century started with one of my heroes, Woodrow Wilson, establishing the League of Nations, which eventually metamorphosed into the United Nations. And we also had what I consider to be one of the most forward-thinking, thoughtful presidents ever, Franklin Roosevelt, a socialist, whose New Deal really was a phenomenal achievement when you think of what he achieved in the first 100 days of his presidency, which affected the world in the long term. And I see the U.S., and as Macron pointed out, the United States, along with other Western powers, is not so much influential anymore. The hegemony is changing. That the U.S., going back to the Suez Crisis, then the Vietnam War, the U.S.'s rising support of Israel after the Six-Day War, the Vietnam War, which went on and on and on. And then it just went downhill. So we had the engagements we had the Iran-Contra scandal, we had engagements, even the ridiculous invasion of Grenada under Ronald Reagan. And then, of course, the Iran and Afghanistan engagements more recently. Now we have President Trump, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Larry Elliott in The Guardian who said that the most recent G7 was a weekend of daycare for Donald Trump.
I wish I'd thought to say that.
Well, George, I tell you, I think that it's amusing, but when you think of it, the degree downward that the U.S. has sunk now is very worrying. And now let's turn to the climate change strikes around the world, mostly by children, young people, and their teachers, with these phenomenal crowds, the turnout in New York City, here in London, all over Britain, all over the world. And considering that the G7 final report was just 250 words, I've got it here, pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. Should have been 250 pages. What did they do? $20 million for the Amazon, a few discussions about Iran.
$20 million. Sheffield United paid more than that for Ollie McBurney.
That's right, exactly.
And if people watching that don't recognise any of those names, that is the point.
That's right, yeah. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's almost laughable. And I think that this discussion today about what becomes of the G7 is serious, because if they're not going to sit and seriously deliberate, the countries that are in it, let alone Russia, China, India, the situation with climate change, forget all the bullets that are flying back and forth, the bombs going off, which are pretty terrible what's happening right now.
Pretty bad for the environment.
It's the environment. That's eventually going to kill us. And I think that this is an issue that if the G7 is going to continue and not be canceled, there is talk, I think somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of canceling next year's, because Trump is already promoting his golf club as the resort where everybody's going to stay in 70 luxury rooms. It really is essential for all of these countries to deal with, to me, the most important thing, climate change.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for that American perspective. Dr. Traore?
You were asking what all these countries have in common. In my opinion, they've got one thing. They are all countries, they are all supremacist countries. This is what they've got in common, if you look at it. And it's very close to imperialism as well. And Macron, his attitude as a French, I think that the reason why some think that he behaves a bit differently and he's got maybe a different conception is because he was trained by the Rothschild, and he thinks a bit more about money. So that's the main difference. For me, the G7 today has nothing to do with economic power. It's more a club where you've got supremacist countries, and the reason why, in a way, they are winning is that because they are getting organized when other countries are not getting organized.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman in the front row.
Dmitry, Linnik, a Russian journalist. As it happens, I was here in London in 1991 for the G7 conference when Mikhail Gorbachev was invited. What is important about that, I think? G7 is not all about economy. I think, proceeding from the GDP and per capita incomes, it's one thing, but Russia was then and still is, and was before the demise of the USSR, a major political power with quite a zone of influence, which the G7 couldn't overlook and just dismiss Russia. So that was a little more than a gesture, I think. Later, when the Eastern European countries and some of the former Soviet countries joined NATO and the European Union, the situation changed. But as for relevance of G7, it's interesting that I recall one of the things discussed in 1991 was illegal logging. And where are we on illegal logging now? Pretty much the same place as back then, perhaps even in a worse place. So that's as far as sort of the consequences of the decisions. I still think the forum, it may have been relevant. Actually, again, going back to 91, sorry. The mood in the Soviet Union back then was that, this was a coming together. Not just the G7 summit, of course, but the situation in general. It was a sort of a hand of friendship across the oceans and seas and political boundaries and all of that. Some years later, everybody realized it failed to materialize. So maybe that was the biggest mistake of the G7 as a political body. It had a chance, I think, to cement the world, to bring it together, and to those shared values. But one of the reasons that it never worked was that the G7 did not recognize Russia's right to its own political, economic, and geopolitical interests. And that's why the G7 or G8 never worked. And actually what Macron said in 2019 was pretty much said by Putin in 2007 in Munich. So now the realization is sinking that indeed Western hegemony is at an end, and the new powers have risen. So the G7,
Can I press you on this point, because it genuinely confounds me. Not only did they not offer a hand of friendship to Russia in the post-Soviet era, they put their hand in your pocket and they stole what they could steal, and they were very happy that you, if you'll forgive me, had a president who was lying drunk on the floor, allowing it all to happen. Their problem is not with Russia, but with Putin, because Putin is a strong leader who has picked Russia off the floor and doesn't let anyone pick his pocket, isn't it?
Interesting. It's a different set of issues, I guess. But, there's a Russia of Yeltsin and there's a Russia of Putin. So saying that, it's just the personality that steers Russia this way or that way, that is not exactly so. But yes, with Putin, it definitely the West saw a different kind of Russia, a Russia which it didn't particularly like. Russia that stands up for itself and can defend itself. So yes, treating the Soviet Union initially and then Russia as a defeated power essentially was the biggest geopolitical mistake that the G7 and the West in general has made.
And that's what gave rise to Putin. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yes. That was a resurgence signified by him. And I mean, we can argue until the cows come home whether he should be staying this long in power or go or whatever. That's a bit of a different story. But of course, the stature of Russia has changed with Putin. And now look at the country, despite the 5 years of sanctions. I was there in July and earlier in February. It's a bustling city. It's not just Moscow. The most sort of the nicest thing is that I keep hearing from people around the country that their cities, their towns, just transformed, in the past few years. So the country's doing pretty well, and any rumors about Russia's demise are premature.
Really exaggerated. Who hasn't spoken would like to contribute? Yes, sir, in the middle there.
Hi, Omar Naghi, and I work in banking. I do have a question rather than a statement. The question is, there are actually G7, there are G20, there are many countries, many organizations, many actually collective countries coming together. What is if the G7 does not represent it by the biggest economies in the world, and it is just a private club. What's the purpose of G7? That's question number one to you or to the audience. Question number two is, what qualify a country to be in that G7? Is it their economics? Is it politically? I mean, do they really need to tick some boxes, assuming there is a very ambitious, developed country?
Do
that
they have
want?
a shared set of values, as the person on the screen
You know,
said?
so those are
If
actually.
so, what are they?
Yeah, those are actually the question that I'd like actually to address it to you, George, or to the audience. Thank you.
Well, they are a collection of former colonial powers, imperialist powers. Just like our presence on the Security Council has nothing to do with our actual importance in the world. It's because we've got a nuclear weapon, many of them. And that qualifies us in perpetuity unless we ourselves vote ourselves off the permanent five, whilst Germany or India can never get on to the Security Council, let alone have a veto on it. If their name comes out of the hat, they get on for a year. And the same is true, isn't it, of this G7, that in a way, it's Hotel California. I mean, Italy is literally bankrupt. Its budget is now written in Brussels. It has no government. Actually, that was the case in Italy for quite a long time, but it has no government. Its governing coalition fell apart just before the G7, but they were still there, whilst much more important, much more powerful, and much more economically significant countries were either rejected, ejected, or simply not invited. Now, let me go back to some of the earlier contributors. Brother, the issue that you raised about Iran paradoxically got me thinking about China. Why is so much negativity directed at China? Why do they go looking for internal problems in China, for example? And I ask you as a Muslim, because one of them is an Islamic issue. They go looking for the Dalai Lama, Tibet, the Falun Gong. They have now gone looking for the Muslim question. Half the world thinks that China is rounding up Muslims and putting them in concentration camps and so on. It's because they want to stop China. They want to block China. They want to stop it realizing its potential. So in that sense, to answer that young man's question, they behave as they do because of what they are. And they don't want new powers to emerge onto the world scene. Am I right?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I'll just sort of start to answer your question. It's multiple attacks on China, as you know, for the last 12 odd weeks. Challenges going on the streets of Hong Kong, while for the last 9 months there have been riots in Paris, and there isn't that sort of
There's one this afternoon in the Champs-Élysées, and there's not one BBC journalist there, not one.
Exactly. And just to sort of not contradict, but sort of give a different nuance to your comment about America, this is a wonderful book that Yanis Varoufakis wrote, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. And there are nuggets in this book. And one nugget that I picked up when I reviewed the book was he talks about Mr. Connolly, who was the Treasury Secretary in 1971 during Nixon's period when the petrodollar came on the scene and the gold sort of basis of the currency was, and then we had fiat currency. And he quotes Mr. Connolly in a wonderful way, which I think really explains the policy and the thinking in Washington. Mr. Connolly says that my philosophy is that all nations are out to screw us, and it's my duty to screw them before they screw us. This is the policy coming out of Washington, expounded by Mr. Connolly.
He was a Texan.
Well, I mean, wherever he's from, but that really, is, in a nutshell, puts what's going on in the global sense that America wants to screw every nation. And you must remember, at that time, Connolly was negotiating with his kith and kin in Europe. There was no America, no Russia, no China, no India who were powerful enough. It was Europe. So he was trying to screw his kith and kin. But when you think from an imperial hat, then these darkies and Chinese are really not even their cousins. So he'll exclude them in a royal manner, if you like, any of the American politicians. But coming back to China, I think the pressure on China is both from an economic angle. As you know, their mobile company Huawei is being prosecuted because China is moving very fast in the technological area.
I've got their new iPhone.
I've been thinking of getting that also myself. Globally, China seems to be winning, as our good friend here said, that, China is sort of giving soft loans, developing other countries globally. So that's another fear.
They've done a huge deal with Iran.
Absolutely. Just only recently, $300 billion or something like that. And not only that, Moscow has set up an alternative to the SWIFT banking system. As you know, Moscow and Tehran, only when the meeting was taking place in Ankara a few days ago, discussing the Syrian issue, the head of the central bank of Iran was there, and they were really working out an alternative to SWIFT, because obviously Europe has failed since US pulled out to set up an alternative payment system. But Russia and Moscow and Tehran have come together and they're doing transactions. So, there are political issues, there are economic issues, and we haven't even touched on the cultural aspect of it.
Well, we don't have time to do
exactly.
that. Professor Trevor, let's assume, and I think it's generally hegemonic in the room, that the sun is setting in the West, as it does. What can these countries do to still be relevant? It's not going to be enough just to have a nuclear bomb, is it?
No, I think it's about a managed decline, a graceful exit from the stage, centre-left. And it's in their interest to do so. We talked a bit about the fact that the world is changing and changing fast. We haven't really gone into a lot of the detail, but partly it's demographic, which we've mentioned. The huge growth in population taking place in other parts of the world outside of the aging economies of many of the advanced Western economies, but also Russia, where its population will shrink dramatically. Japan's population is already shrinking fast. Germany's will shrink quite rapidly too. So their share of the world's population and therefore the world's output will shrink alongside, and their influence will go with it too. What they need to make sure they leave behind is a world order which allows, in a way, a rules-based system to be maintained, so all of the gains that they have made historically through what they've done, both good and bad, is sustained into a future where they no longer have the influence to make the decisions for the whole world. And so the G7 for me is a relic of that past. Yes, in some senses they do have some shared values. I disagree about some of what's been said in the nuance that people make about someone like Putin, who wants to be president for life, someone like Xi Jinping, who's made himself president for life. In a world, for me, where you need to have cooperation, where people, through the technology that we currently have and the spread of that technology, which empowers individuals, which democratizes countries and frees people from the constraints of the environment in which they live and the control which is imposed by the social order that they may have. You can look around the world through your iPhone and just see stuff going on elsewhere that no country can stop, other than what someone's currently trying to do, which is to set up an internet within their own country so that people can't see what's going on elsewhere. So to answer your question, therefore, managed decline is what faces them, and they should accept it and go into the twilight gently and allow actors onto the stage.
That doesn't happen often in life, Trevor.
It doesn't happen very often, but I think it'll happen this time, George, and the reason is they have a vested interest in maintaining it. You don't want revolution. Revolutionary change never works well.
I know you don't like
Evolutionary change is better.
I've only got a minute, so I want to ask you a question. I'm taking advantage of the fact that you're here. When I was a child, I was a Roman Catholic child. In every one of our homes, we had a black baby, and that we put a penny in the hand of the black baby and it swallowed it. And Africa for us was a land of hungry babies. And we grew up imagining that Africa was an utterly derelict place. Yet Africa is in fact perhaps the richest continent of them all.
Yes, and look, I've written about this, by the way. I don't know if you asked the question because you knew that, but the population of Africa is the fastest growing in the world. It's the youngest in the world. If you take the continent of Africa, not a lot of people know this, to paraphrase someone, but you could put America, China, India, and all of Western Europe inside Africa, and it would fit. It has all of the resources necessary for the next generation of technologies that are required. Its population will exceed Asia's over the next 50 years. Nigeria, for example, by 2047, will have the same population of all of Western Europe. 770 million Nigerians will exist in this world. So you're absolutely right about that continent. And it was never this continent that's been painted anyway. First of all, the West got rich by plundering its people and selling them and using their labor to generate capital for the Industrial Revolution. And then it stole resources from them too, remember. The Congo and what the Belgians did there, and other parts where they got gold and oil, and obviously the history of Rhodesia and Zimbabwe and South Africa where resources were taken out. But there's still huge amounts of resources, and the people are now able to participate in the world economy, and eventually I think that that's part of the revolutionary change
They'll
that
maybe
is
even
coming.
get in the G7. Professor, thank you very much. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra. Thank you for watching.